Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. We have the honor today to have Dr. Randi Mendes, who is the director for New England Brownfields Technical Assistance Center. This is an EPA-funded project, and it's been doing very well. So our TikTok center is called Thriving Communities, and Randi has been helping New England communities to become thriving communities for a little while now. And brownfields are everywhere in New England, so this is a wonderful opportunity for all of us to learn more about where the brownfields are and what Randi's center is doing about them. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Randi Mendes.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. So as mentioned, my name is Randi Mendes. My background is in environmental engineering, and I am the program director for UConn TAB. TAB stands for Technical Assistance to Brownfields, and as Carolyn mentioned, we are the free provider of technical assistance to New England communities. In the world of brownfields, there's an unfortunate amount of acronyms and technical jargon. So I'm going to do my best to make sure I'm not bringing that into this discussion. But if you have any questions on anything that I bring up, please let me know. Don't hesitate to ask. And just starting even with TAB. So if you see TAB anywhere, that's Technical Assistance to Brownfields, and we refer to ourselves as UConn TAB. So just kind of giving you an outline of what today's webinar will cover. The first being, what are brownfields? So just getting all of us on the same page on what brownfields actually are. How does a community get started with the brownfield redevelopment process, and then how UConn TAB as an entity can help communities along the way with this process. So starting with the first, talking about brownfields and identifying them. EPA has a specific definition for brownfields. Some states within New England also kind of have their own definition. Not all of them do, but basically it just adds a couple more defining factors to what the definition actually is. EPA defines it as a real property where the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So quite a mouthful of words and very vague, and intentionally so. This is meant to kind of keep an open idea and concept of what sites could fall into the brownfield category, but it does create enough boundaries that indicate what can and cannot. So in plain language, a brownfield site is a site that is completely or partially abandoned. We look for sites that are underutilized and that there is likely some form of contamination present due to its past use. How you can identify a brownfield in your community is you look for areas of blight, if there's any deterioration of a building, looking for abandoned buildings, eyesores, and then inactive or underutilized facilities, so older industrial buildings. I have some examples of brownfields that you typically see in communities. So probably the most commonly thought of, aside from mill buildings, is gas stations. So abandoned gas stations are one of the stereotypical brownfield sites. Active gas stations are not brownfields. While there is this concept that maybe down the road they'd be a brownfield, when identifying a brownfield, it's kind of a snapshot in that moment in time. So if it is active, it would not be considered one. But inactive, abandoned ones are. One of the ones that is not commonly thought of is dry cleaning facilities. So there's chemicals and contaminants that were used and sometimes dumped on the site. And so we often see these on brownfield lists. And then the more typical, as mentioned before, older mill buildings, old industrial sites. New England has a ton of mill buildings. So those are usually the ones we see the most here. But you could also potentially see brownfields in school buildings. So if you have buildings built before the 1970s and there was asbestos used, you might see brownfields if there's illegal dumping on a site. So you might have a site that was never used for anything, but it has illegal dumping occurring. That could be a brownfield. And while it's not always the most exciting or the most desired thing to name a property, especially if it's a private property, as a brownfield. The reason why it's important to create this identification is that it opens up a world of funding opportunities and services that can be provided to a community for free. So now that we have a concept of what is a brownfield, it's important to point out what is not a brownfield. So active facilities of any kind, even if contamination is suspected, are not brownfields. So in this case, again, sometimes we'll see sites where there was some kind of spill, if there was a list somewhere of an oil spill or something, but if the site is active and running, it would not be considered a brownfield. Superfund sites, which are very highly contaminated sites, typically are not considered brownfields. The caveat to that is if they're not on the national priority list. So there is a scoring process that occurs with Superfund sites that basically ranks how bad they are. The higher up in that scale of badness puts them on the national priority list. And those that are not could then be considered brownfields. And this is partly because it's just different pockets of money that are funding different activities. Residential buildings without hazardous building materials are typically not brownfields. And then sites under federal jurisdiction are also not brownfields. Despite giving kind of this overarching kind of what is and what's not, it still is a very complicated process. And that's one of the things that UConn TAB is here to help with, is helping with identifying whether or not a site is considered a brownfield or not. So the reason why we care about this is that within New England, there are over 3,000 brownfields that have been formally identified, and this does not include all the ones that have not yet been identified. This is just related to sites that are on a specific list because they've been associated to a grant. In my experience when helping communities, this number is maybe a third of what actually is existing, just because there's so many that are not on some formal grant. Communities are plagued with these sites with no funding to do anything about them. So it's a relevant issue, it's an important issue, and it's a ubiquitous issue. In addition to them just being there, these sites can impact human health, ecosystem health. They can impact the local economy, driving property values down. You know, if you have blight in your area, it could cause safety concerns, trespassing, you know, unwanted activity in the area. And then it can also impact the community's vitality. So these sites are really crucial to a community when it comes to getting them redeveloped. So how does one get started in this process? And mind you, this process is going to be a stepwise presentation, but these sites can be really complicated. They can take a lot of time to redevelop. And so in no ways is this a cookie cutter process in the sense that you do this every time. There's often you go to step 1, 2, 3, and then you're back at step 1. Maybe you go back up again and then you come back. So it's a very iterative process and you kind of just keep going along the way. And this is just a very high level overview of what a theoretical approach would be. So step 1 is developing the brownfields in the area. So you want to have a good concept and idea of what actually is existing in your community. You might be like Springfield, Connecticut, or Springfield, Mass, and have a ton. You could be like another community that just has 1 or 2, but they're very large and impacting the community. So you want to kind of get the width and the full picture of how many and how big and how much land they're taking up. And so one of the ways that UConn TAB can support this is by creating a brownfield inventory. So you can obviously do this yourself as a community if you want to kind of informally create an inventory of the sites that you believe to be brownfields, or you can utilize us in our free service to do this. In our brownfield inventories, we put together an exhaustive informational Excel sheet that gives you more information than you ever thought you wanted to know about these sites, which includes some of the basic things like the site address, previous owner, zoning, to things beyond that, such as if it's in a flood zone, is there wetland? Have there been any grants associated to it? Are there any currently leaking underground storage tanks? What's the parking situation? Have there been any public utilities, etc.? So we put all of this information into an Excel sheet as well as a report that we include with it. The way that we do this is we start off by looking at what the knowns are. So if there's any sites associated to a grant already, if there's any on your state's list of potentially contaminated sites, We do what I like to call Google creep, where we look on Google Maps of the area and try to see if we can identify based on the community's industrial history where sites might be. And then finally, we do a site visit where we drive around the community and try to identify visually any additional sites that might exist. All of this, we're working with the community hand in hand. We update them and they are a part of the process. So once we have a good idea of what the sites are, we create a prioritization list. And this is basically based on the goals that you have for moving forward, how you want to redevelop the sites, if you're seeking a certain funding type, et cetera. So it's important to work with your community to best understand their goals and their needs. And one of the things that we can do is also help with creating this prioritization. So when we do our inventories, once we have all the sites confirmed, one of our next steps is to work with the community to identify what their priorities are. We create a list of criteria that we then create a weighted scoring. We score each of the sites, and then the sites with the highest scoring then become your priority sites. Typically, what we see as common criteria for prioritization is location. So for example, if you want your main street to be the focus of a future grant, if you're interested in applying for an assessment grant and you want to know what sites still need that kind of funding, that's kind of some of the different criteria, but it's really open to whatever your community finds important. Step 3 is identifying your team. In the world of brownfields, it's almost impossible to work on any of this by yourself. So I know that can be a very difficult thing for smaller communities, for rural communities. Capacity is one of the biggest issues that we see, and that's what we're here to help with, alleviate some of the stress by providing these free services. But we always recommend, even then, reaching out. The brownfields world is a very close-knit community in the sense that they're always open and willing to help. I like to look at it as when you're framing your team, this pyramid, the smallest one is kind of the state level, and you want to then, as you go down the pyramid, incorporate more people along that larger section. So your final team should have a lot of community members in it. You'll be surprised how many are excited to be involved. But some of the other people that you could get involved are economic development. They usually have a good pulse on developers, public health officials. So if you need to communicate any concerns of contaminants on a site, environmental groups, local community organizations, especially CBOs, they're very helpful community-based organizations, and then the general public. One of the things that UConn TAB does do is a stakeholder analysis. And basically that can help you with identifying key players in your community that would be interested or maybe helpful in the decision making and what their role could be in the process of the team. The next step is determining the current status, ownership, and liability. So this is probably by far the most complicated part of the process. This entails kind of doing the assessment, understanding due diligence of who's responsible for the contamination, making sure that if a town or a CBO acquires a site, that you're not also inheriting the liability of the cleanup. And so starting with kind of just the general process of what happens with a site is you do an assessment first. That's then followed by the cleanup and then ultimately the redevelopment. However, this process isn't quite that simple. For example, like I said, when you're doing your first step of assessment, it's very important to do a phase 1 prior to acquiring a site, so that way you don't inherit the liability of the contamination. Basically, this is kind of the legal jargon of explaining why that's important, but essentially always do your due diligence, always do that phase 1. This is something that you do have to hire a consultant to do. UConn TAB does what we call a record review, which is essentially like a phase 1, but because we are not licensed environmental professionals, we cannot legally sign off on anything. But what it does help with the service that we provide is allowing a community to kind of come into that conversation more informed and more understanding of like what the actual issue is on the site. So from a legal standpoint, you want to do this phase 1 180 to 360 days before the acquisition to make sure you're not liable for the site. Once you do that phase 1, typically the next step is a phase 2. Phase 2 involves actual testing of the site, understanding if there's contamination. Different states kind of talk through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 differently. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because it can be a little bit confusing depending on what state you're in. But essentially, phase 1 is kind of the information gathering. Phase 2 is the testing. Phase 3 can be further testing and or kind of the start of the development of a remediation plan. Then you have the cleanup, and then hopefully after the cleanup, the redevelopment. However, these steps take time. Cleanups can take anywhere between 1 to 5 years, if not sometimes longer. And the reason for this is sometimes when you're in the middle of the cleanup, you can somehow find, another plume or something that's been uncovered or some other kind of contamination. Sometimes funding can be the time restraint. So it's important to be patient, but also to be communicating with the public at all times. There's been many situations I've seen where communities think absolutely nothing is going on with the site and they're concerned, and rightfully so, but there is actually a lot going on behind the scenes. So it's important to continue to communicate. So step 5, which is maybe the most interesting and exciting, is the funding side of it. So how you can get these sites assessed and cleaned up without using your own funding. So I specifically, our team anyways, specifically supports the EPA Brownfield grants. We also do reviews of state grants as well, but we are best with the EPA Brownfield grants. But these are some of the other sources of federal funding that do exist for brownfields. So there's a targeted brownfield assessment, which is funding directly from the EPA to assess a singular site. There's a job training program, which allows funding to help create more jobs within a community specific to kind of environmental cleanup. Technical assistance, which is us. It's not necessarily funding to get a site cleaned up, but we are the free service that can help you along the way. There's some state and tribal response programs, land revitalization technical assistance. This can help with some of the future planning of how the redevelopment will look. They can help with market studies if your community doesn't have one. There's the CERCLA section 128A, technical assistance grants. That can be a funding source. And then lastly, as I mentioned, these MARC grants. So MARC stands for Multi-Purpose Assessment, Revolving Loan, and Cleanup. So the first letter of each makes up the acronym. Each year it rotates between having the multi-purpose or the revolving loan fund. So this last grant cycle, we did not have the multi-purpose, but we had the revolving loan. The next cycle, which will come in next fall, will not have we'll have the multi-purpose, but not the revolving loan. These grants are open to public entities, so municipalities, local government, nonprofits, state and tribal entities, regional agencies, redevelopment agencies, and of course, an entity is only eligible if they're not liable for the contamination. So you have to make sure you do that phase 1 and that you're not at all responsible for it. These grants are competitive in nature and there is a limited amount of funding, but UConn TAB does provide a very thorough template and guidebook, as well as webinars and reviewing for these grants. And we have about an 85% success rate. So if this is something that you're interested in pursuing, definitely seek out our services for the review process and always start early. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but these are also different state funding mechanisms that are available for the assessment and cleanup of brownfields. Each state's environmental department kind of has their own method and different grant opportunities. So you should definitely take this out, look into this. These are linked. They're also on our website as resources to check out later. Step 6 is positioning your community for brownfield success. So you want to think about what that future design is going to be. And we see that even in the grant applications, they ask to see what are you looking to have the brownfields redeveloped into and how is that benefiting the community based on what you said their needs and hopes are. So what UConn TAB does is what we call site reuse assessment project. And basically what we do is we look into all factors of a site. So for example, property information, opportunities and constraints, what the community is looking at and what the market currently is. And we create a holistic report with renderings included that basically say what's a feasible concept for your community. This is obviously something that we do alongside the community. We are in no way saying this is what you have to do or this is what you should do. It's a multi-stepped approach where we work with the community to hear out what they want. We come up with something. Oftentimes there's a community meeting that follows this where we get feedback on what do they hate, what do they like, what are some more priorities or the things that they think are missing, etc. And we do kind of an iterative process to put together this final rendering for them. But things like this can be really helpful when attracting a developer after a site is cleaned up, because it shows that there is a feasible option to what you're hoping to accomplish with the redevelopment. The next step, step 7, is community engagement. So you want to make sure that you're communicating with the community, and often we see kind of this town meeting level where this communication is happening, which is completely fine. But in some communities, you'll see that attendance is kind of low. And so we try to help you with coming up with creative solutions to combat that and try to give you some guidelines on what might be helpful for incorporating more audience that is maybe not typically a part of the conversation, but should be a part of the conversation. Some of the tips that we suggest are identifying your stakeholders ahead of time. So if you have community members who maybe can help disseminate the information better than you can, so if you have CBOs or local community groups that are going to be able to, give that information out and spread it to a community that's not typically at your meetings, that's helpful. Always making sure that the information is accessible. So, sometimes people have internet, sometimes they don't. So kind of thinking through whether an online forum makes sense. Maybe printing things out is better. So basically, again, you just want to make sure you're factoring in all these considerations when planning. Other things to think about is just always being inclusive, both about the location of meetings. Are you considering the timing? A lot of meetings we typically see are at like 5 o'clock, thinking, people are out of work so they can come to a town meeting then. However, what we've learned is you sometimes have families where after 5, there's no longer childcare, so they don't necessarily have the option to attend because there's no childcare at the meeting. Or maybe that's when it's time for them to eat. So sometimes providing childcare and food at these meetings can make it so that more people can come. The amount of town halls that I've seen that are not ADA compliant, sometimes that makes it that the town hall is not necessarily the best location. So thinking about if there's another area in your community that you can have these meetings, again, just to make all of this information accessible. In addition to that, UConn TAB, one of the services that we provide is taking technical documents and kind of synthesizing them to be more community facing, which can be really helpful for this kind of stuff. So we're more than happy to help with putting things into plain language so that community members can be informed on what's going on. Step 8, finalizing a redevelopment plan and finding a developer. So you want to make sure that your development is sustainable, the community is involved, and that there's going to be economic growth. So you basically want this to be benefiting everybody. And we do see this with Brownfields. Obviously, it's not a perfect system, but we do try to make sure along the way that displacement isn't occurring and that the community really is benefiting from these sites. And some of the ways that you can do that is making agreements with your developer. So we have tools to help with creating a community benefits agreement, which is basically an agreement between the municipality, the community, and the developer that promises basically fair future plans, and so that the community is not displaced, both economically, not just physically or culturally as well. But basically, you ultimately will need a developer in this process to fund kind of the redevelopment of the site and to see the benefits of economic growth and the health of the site no longer being a brownfield. So some of the things that can be helpful with this is performing a market study if you haven't already, marketing your site as much as possible, so putting together web pages with this information, using the site reuse assessment that I mentioned previously as supporting information, looking and thinking about tax breaks that you could offer a developer, and just expanding your network, going to conferences and talking to people. That's going to be the best way to kind of open your circle to identify developers. And so finally, going into how UConn TAB can help. I know I mentioned kind of briefly along the way, but here's kind of the summary of it. So our core team, and this is not inclusive of everybody, but our core team includes myself, our 2 project managers, community liaison, Katie Malgilio, and then we have some students that have also been working with us. But we're a diverse team that kind of allows us to cover quite a few different expertise and allows us to help these communities that we're supporting through our programs and free services. Our services at a glance include direct technical assistance, our municipal assistance program, continuing education, and then community engagement. And again, we support all of New England, which includes these 6 states, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Mass, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. There are entities similar to us that support the rest of the states in the country. Within our direct technical assistance, this entails technical document review, so we can review environmental site assessment reports, like I mentioned before, kind of putting them in plain language. We can look at remedial action plans and planning documents and help a community understand what they're actually saying, because they can be very convoluted and confusing, and they're also very, very long, so it can be helpful to have somebody kind of synthesize the information. Proposal reviews, so we can look at grant reviews, both EPA and state grants. Access to resources, so we have fact sheets, examples. We've done a lot with procurement now, so if a community needs to acquire a consultant to do some of the assessment or cleanup work, we can help you with drafting up that process. And then we have what we call online office hours, but really more so you send us an email and we respond pretty quickly, set up a meeting to chat with you to talk through any issues or concerns or questions that you might have. Our municipal assistance program is probably our most popular and my favorite program because it involves students in the process as well. So because we're housed at UConn, we have a Brownfields class where we have students who learn about Brownfields in the fall, get partnered with an entity to work on a project, and then in the spring they kind of act as more of an intern where they're also still working with the municipality on a project. All of these groups are overseen by someone from our team. The way that it breaks down, as I mentioned, in the fall is more of the learning phase of it, so learning more about Brownfields, but they also help the community through the supporting of a Brownfield grant. So communities who are interested in applying for an EPA Brownfield grant will apply to be a part of our program, and the students help support putting together information for that grant. In the spring and summer, so January through April and roughly May through August, we do more technical projects. So that'll focus on Brownfield inventories, data gaps, grant preparation, so getting ahead of the game, site reuse planning, and community engagement planning. So again, these are students working with a municipality and then working with a member of our team to accomplish these projects. The students kind of bring a very creative, new, excited lens that the municipality seems to really enjoy. They also get the students at the end of it get the real world experience of working on these projects in real time and seeing kind of the outcome of how it's benefiting a community, as well as the resume boost of working on these projects. So lastly, what I have is just some upcoming opportunities that we have at UConn TAB. So as part of the continuing education, we host about 3 to 4 webinars each semester. I've included some of the ones that have already passed, just so that way if you're interested in going to our website and seeing the recordings, you can check them out. We do have some coming up. So for example, April 16th, we have one on using Brownfield funding for local planning. So looking at how you can use funding for planning studies. And then May 1st and May 22nd, we're doing a joint national TAB webinar. So all of the TABs are going to be coming together to talk about preparing for the EPA Brownfield grants. Other services that we provide, procurement support that happens year round. So if you're interested, just send us an email to set up a meeting and we can chat through that. Grant support, we always encourage you to get started as soon as possible. So we're more than happy to have a conversation with that. And then lastly, a plug that our summer map is now open. So if you're interested in participating in this program and having a project with us, the program is open. You can apply on our website. It's a very, very short application. It's really just more a formality of including your name, contact information, a little bit more information about the project you're hoping to get help with. The applications are due April 25th. Following the application, we just set up a quick call to chat with you to better understand the scope of the support you're requesting. And it's kind of an informal, you've been accepted at that point. But yeah, so thank you all for listening through that. I know that was a lot, so I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has. Otherwise, I've included the email, the website, our LinkedIn, and where you can join our mailing list if you're interested in getting some more information.
Thank you, Randi. This is Jen, just moderating Q&A. We did have one question come through the chat from Andrea Berry. She's part of the New England, so it's NEEFC. And Andrea, you can come off mute and ask your question, but I can just read it aloud quickly. Do farmlands where PFAS contaminated sludge was spread count as a brownfield?
Yes. So again, you kind of have that limbo of the liability issue being there. But typically, yes. So we see in rural communities where big farm industry was prevalent. So it doesn't have to just be PFAS. It could be other things that are contaminating the site, but those could potentially count as brownfields as well. Yes. It's definitely a hot topic in the world of brownfields right now, since the regulations are kind of constantly being updated and or changed. So it's definitely keep an eye out for other webinars and information that come out on that.
I have a question. Could I ask? Okay. So PFAS is a very special type of issue. So has TAB, UConn TAB taken up a project that addresses PFAS so far?
The only thing that we've kind of been working on is creating a contaminant page that helps the community understand the risk kind of associated to if PFAS is present. I'm sure we've had sites where there is PFAS contamination. Typically, once we're helping with the grant process, either the contaminants have not really been identified yet, which is partly why they're doing the assessment, or if they're in the cleanup stage. I don't really know that we've had too many cleanup grants that are addressing PFAS yet. The tricky part is that because the guidelines are constantly changing and shifting, that there's been a lot of sites where PFAS testing just never even happened. So there's kind of this interesting space that we're living in right now where it is an emergent contaminant. It's a huge concern, and a lot of communities are really nervous about it. But there's also seeming to be a lot of known liable parties with the contamination. So I'm seeing more that the funding for cleanup is more privately being handled rather than going to the brownfield funding at this point.
Yeah, I think especially in Connecticut, testing the PFAS is going kind of slow. They take a long-term view for some reason, even though in some communities this is a problem. It's the problems here. Yes, that's what I understand. Okay. I think there's a hand raised.
Brian, you have a question?
Yeah.
I was just wondering, how many brownfields would you estimate there are in the Northeast or New England beyond those counted already?
Oh, if I could do like a quick estimate, I would say double, if not triple, what's already there, just from some of the inventories we've already done. So for example, I'm in Mansfield, Connecticut, and we are currently working on an inventory for Windham, Connecticut, and their current inventory that's publicly known says 2. So far, I think we're up to over 20 that actually are there. So, you know, in some communities, it's not as drastic of a difference as that, but in others, it can be. So it's kind of hard to say, but my best guess would be at least like double to triple what's known.
Got it. Thanks so much.
Well, if anyone thinks of any other questions, feel free to send me or the UConn TAB email your question. We're happy to set up a meeting or do what we can to help.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Randi Mendes. This is Mendes, and she'll be back next week. It's a continuing Brownfields series. Thank you, everyone.